All right, here's the really quick version that takes us from the Articles of Confederation to the creation of the Constitution. Remember, the Articles of Confederation are the first constitution after independence. Um, there's a lot of structural problems to it. Remember, there's only one branch of government, and it's a single chambered Congress. Every state sends representatives, but each state only gets one vote. There's no executive branch, there's no judicial branch. Both of those functions carried out by states. Um, some of the problems are that it doesn't have enough power at the national level. The only things that it does are things that would have been consistent with the understanding of government's role at this time period, which was major foreign policy, international stuff, and then major economic things like make money. Everything else should be done at the state level. Some of the specific powers that lacked that create problems are the ability to tax and regulate trade among states, and so we get some economic trouble. Every state prints their own currency. There's massive inflation. States are taxing each other. And so all of this culminates with Shays' Rebellion, group of farmers who are about to have their land foreclosed on. So they get torches and pitchforks, they storm their capital. And of course, there's no U.S. military to really do anything about it. It requires state militia. And so Madison's big concern was not, foreign invasion. His big concern was domestic insurrection, like Shays' Rebellion, happening over and over. And so Shays' Rebellion kind of convinced people that we needed to send representatives to the Constitutional Convention. There had been efforts to do it before, but every state did it after Shays' Rebellion. Their plan is to go and revise the articles, but they end up scrapping the document entirely and creating the U.S. Constitution. So the Grand Committee, made up of a couple of key figures here in designing the Constitution, several new powers are given to the national government. Now, Madison argued these weren't new, they just simply were better ways of doing things that they had already had the power to do. Nevertheless, the power to coin money is now exclusive to the federal government. The power to regulate trade under the Commerce Clause, the power to tax and spend money. Congress has, under the Necessary and Proper Clause, the ability to make any law that they think will help them carry out constitutional responsibilities. And the National Supremacy Clause makes laws of Congress and acts of the President supreme law of the land, unless, of course, their actions are unconstitutional. Remember, the original Constitution does not have a Bill of Rights, and it doesn't have any statement that remaining powers will stay in the hands of the states. If you click on this link here, you'll have access to the table of contents, basically an overall description of what's in the Constitution. I gave this to you earlier in the year. That will be helpful for you. These are constitutional clauses that you should probably know by heart to make it easier on test day. Remember, the debate over the Constitution contains several compromises. The first, how will states be represented in the new Congress? The Virginia plan says it should be based on population. The New Jersey plan says it needs to be equal. And so the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, simply combine the two plans. We have a House of Representatives, which bases representation on a state's population, and we have the New Jersey plan, which bases it on equality, the bicameral legislature. The Electoral College, of course, is a compromise between advocates for direct election of president and those who said it needs to be somebody like either the U.S. Congress, state Congresses, state governors, some other entity beyond a direct popular election. So the Electoral College simply combines those two ideas. The public votes for electors, who then vote for president on behalf of the citizens they represent. The Three-Fifths Compromise also dealt with representation in the Congress. Will slaves count towards the state's population totals or not? The South says they should, the North says they should not, and so the compromise is slaves shall count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in Congress. They also debated whether or not to continue to allow the importation of new slaves, and the compromise is that there will be no law regarding the slave trade for 20 years. There's also debates, as you can remember from Federalist 70, about how many people should make up the executive branch. Should it be a council of folks? Should it be a single individual? And the single individual won out because, of course, the advocates for a strong executive, energy in the executive is a key feature of good government, according to Federalist 70. And then they knew that these debates wouldn't be the end of the thing, and so they put in a provision in Article 5 for how to amend the Constitution in the future. And so that amendment process is simple. You need 2/3 of each chamber of Congress to agree, and then the amendment goes to the states, and you need 3/4 of the states to agree to the amendment for it to be ratified. So two rival factions are created over whether the Constitution is good or not. You have the Federalists who supported the new Constitution, thought that the national government needed a little bit more power than it currently had. Those were folks like Madison and John Adams and Hamilton and Washington. And then you had the Anti-Federalists who were concerned that the new Constitution would give far too much power to the national government and that the states would lose their rights. And so these were some of the folks who were key revolutionary figures, and so they opposed it. The Federalist Papers, of course, a bunch of letters to newspapers in New York to convince New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. And each of their arguments is a counter to what the Anti-Federalists are saying. Remember, the Anti-Federalists are concerned about too much centralized power. They were particularly concerned about the National Supremacy Clause, which they thought would render state governments useless, and they were concerned about what seemed like unlimited power with the Necessary and Proper Clause. They were also massively concerned that there was no Bill of Rights. Even the English government had a Bill of Rights. How can this Constitution not have one? They were concerned about a single centralized government being in charge of every one of the states, and they thought in order to control all of the states and to govern everybody, it would have to be really powerful to do so, and they opposed that. The Federalist counterpoints were based on the economic concerns that we're seeing, that the government needs more power, needs to be able to tax and regulate trade. It needs to have the ability to create a military. National laws have to be supreme over the states, provided that they're constitutional, because otherwise states are free to ignore any of those national guidelines that all of the states had agreed to in the first place. Madison, in particular, argues that the federal government's power will be limited through checks and balances and separation of powers, and that the states are going to retain every power that's not enumerated for the federal government in the Constitution. And so the 10th Amendment is specifically added to address this concern. Remember, the 10th Amendment, any powers not given to the national government remain in the hands of the states. Madison also argued a Bill of Rights would be unnecessary because the Constitution itself already provides proper restraint of central government, and so listing them would be unnecessary. You can look at this chart on your own to get a quick summary of those things. And then this language here is just directly from the AP Government Standards. Obviously, you need to do the legwork to have an in-depth knowledge of both of those documents. And that's how we go from the Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution.